There's something about the Predator franchise that never really leaves the back of your mind once you've grown up with it. That idea that somewhere out there, in the dark spaces between stars or deep in a forest you don't fully understand, something is watching, learning, waiting for you to make the first mistake. And now with Predator Badlands, that old fear doesn't feel like nostalgia anymore. It feels like it's being rebuilt for a new generation, but in a way that doesn't forget what made it dangerous in the first place. When the first teaser imagery and early concept details started slipping out around this project, it didn't hit like a typical studio announcement. It felt quieter, more controlled, almost like they were trying not to repeat the mistakes of past Predator sequels that overloaded the mythology instead of sharpening it. And that alone already tells you something different is happening here.
What immediately stands out is the shift in tone. You don't get the sense this is just another predator hunts humans in the jungle setup. The word Badlands itself carries weight. It suggests isolation, harsh terrain, survival conditions that strip everything down to basics. No clean environments, no easy escapes. Just raw survival where the landscape itself feels like an enemy before the predator even enters the frame. And that's where things start to get interesting. The trailer doesn't lean into exposition the way modern sci-fi usually does. Instead, it opens with silence, wide, empty landscapes, dry, cracked earth stretching out like it's been abandoned for centuries. You get these long shots where the world feels almost dead, except for subtle movement in the wind, shifting dust, broken remnants of something that used to exist there. There's a feeling that humanity isn't just being hunted here, it's already losing. Then you start noticing the small details. A fractured expedition log, scratched warning symbols on stone, equipment half buried in sand that doesn't belong to any recognizable Earth ecosystem. That's the first real hint that Badlands might not even be fully grounded on Earth as we know it. Or if it is, it's a version of Earth that's been pushed far beyond collapse. And that's where the Predator enters the conversation again in a very different way. That idea alone changes everything we think we know about how these creatures operate. Because traditionally, the predator is a hunter who arrives, completes the ritual, and leaves. But Badlands seems to be playing with the idea that maybe this time, something went wrong with that cycle. Maybe the hunt isn't just sport anymore. Maybe it's survival for the predator itself. There's a sequence in the trailer that sticks in your head longer than you expect. A lone survivor figure, no clear identity yet, but presented with a kind of exhausted physicality that suggests they've been running for a long time, moves through what looks like the skeleton of a crashed transport ship. Not military, not civilian in any clean sense, something industrial, almost colonial in design. And that's where the film starts quietly tying itself into a broader sci-fi framework without ever saying it directly. You don't need dialogue to understand what happened there. You just see broken supply crates, scorched interior walls, and emergency systems that failed long before anyone could use them properly. It suggests an expedition that wasn't prepared for what this environment actually is. Then the sound design kicks in, and it's not the usual predator clicking or iconic sonar pulses right away. It's subtler, distant metallic movement, something heavy dragging across stone. Breathing that doesn't belong to a human, but also doesn't fully match the classic Predator audio signature either. There's variation in it, almost like evolution or environmental adaptation has altered the way the creature exists. That's when the fear starts to feel different. because it's no longer about a known hunter. It's about unpredictability again. One of the most intriguing things about Badlands is how it seems to position its human characters not as elite soldiers or commandos, but as fragmented survivors from different failed systems. You get hints of scientists, maybe corporate recovery teams, possibly even prisoners or forced labor groups depending on how the final cut frames it. And that's a smart move if the goal is to bring tension back into the franchise, because the more skilled the humans become, the more the predator becomes a puzzle. But when you strip them down, when they're injured, unprepared, psychologically unstable, you bring the franchise back to its original emotional core. Fear of the unknown in a place where no one is coming to save you. There's also something visually different about how the predator itself is framed in these early glimpses. The armor doesn't appear as polished or ceremonial as earlier iterations. It looks functional in a more brutal sense. Scarred plating, modified gear, little inconsistencies that suggest either damage or deliberate adaptation. That opens up a lot of questions without answering any of them. Has this predator been stranded longer than expected? Is it part of a larger clan that has evolved differently in this environment? Or is this something else entirely? A subgroup that broke away from the traditional code we've seen in earlier films? The trailer never confirms anything, but it plants those ideas carefully, like breadcrumbs leading into something bigger. And what's really interesting is the pacing choice. Modern action trailers tend to overload you with spectacle, quick cuts, explosions, big musical swells. But here, there's restraint. You get moments where the camera just holds on empty space long enough to make you uncomfortable. Long enough that your brain starts filling in what isn't being shown. That's classic horror technique, but it's rare to see it applied to a franchise that's often been pushed toward action-heavy spectacle in later entries. At one point, there's a shot of a character looking up at a cliff face. You don't see what they're reacting to. You just see their expression shift from confusion to immediate, quiet dread. And then the camera cuts away before revealing anything. That decision alone tells you the filmmakers understand something important. The predator works best when it's not constantly visible, when its presence is felt more than seen. There's also a recurring visual motif of broken tracking technology. Screens glitching, thermal scans failing, infrared systems picking up signals that don't behave consistently. It suggests that in this environment, even the human advantage of detection is unreliable, and that brings everything closer to the original spirit of the franchise again. Because the moment you remove certainty, you bring back tension. By the final moments of the trailer, you get a brief glimpse, almost too quick to fully register, of the predator standing against a storm-lit horizon, not in motion, not attacking, just observing. And that's the part that sticks, because it doesn't feel like a monster reveal. It feels like acknowledgement, like this isn't just a creature hunting randomly anymore. It feels aware of the environment in a deeper way, like it belongs to it in a way the humans never will. Then everything cuts to black. No clean tagline, no over-explained setup. Just silence again, as if the film wants the absence of sound to do the final piece of storytelling. And that's where Predator, Badlands, starts to separate itself from expectations. It's not trying to reinvent the predator by making it louder or bigger or more complicated in dialogue. it seems to be doing the opposite, stripping everything down, returning to isolation, returning to uncertainty, returning to the idea that survival in this universe is not about fighting harder, but about understanding just how little control you actually have when something far older, far more adapted, and far more patient is watching you from just outside your field of vision. The story starts in a way that doesn't really feel like a traditional sci-fi setup, and that's probably the first clue that Predator Badlands is trying to mess with expectations from the very beginning. We're dropped into this environment without clean introductions, without the comfort of a structured briefing scene where someone explains what's happening. Instead, it feels like we're already inside the aftermath of something that went wrong long before the audience arrived. A fractured recovery operation is scattered across a wide, desolate stretch of terrain that doesn't behave like anything fully familiar. It's not just desert, not just wasteland, not just some generic, harsh planet aesthetic. There are layers to it. Rock formations that look eroded by time, but also scorched by energy exposure. Patches of ground that shimmer slightly in the heat, like something underneath is still unstable. And scattered remnants of infrastructure that don't match any single Earth origin design language. The humans here aren't introduced as heroes. That's important. They're introduced as survivors of a failed objective. There's a small group, loosely connected by necessity rather than trust. Some of them clearly came from a corporate-backed expedition, heavy utilitarian gear, modular survival rigs, communication systems that are already glitching out. Others feel like they were pulled into this operation under less voluntary circumstances. You can tell from the way they carry themselves that this wasn't a clean mission briefing situation. This is the kind of team that was assembled quickly because something important went missing, and the people in charge didn't want questions asked. And the way they talk, when they do talk, has that tired, cautious tone of people who already know the mission failed before they ever stepped outside their ship. The inciting incident isn't a loud explosion or a dramatic attack. It's quieter than that. A signal recovery attempt. One of the surviving technicians manages to stabilize a fractured transmission coming from deep within the Badlands region. It's not a distress call in the traditional sense. It's fragmented, repetitive, partially corrupted. But there are enough recognizable patterns in it to suggest human origin. Maybe even multiple human origins layered over each other, as if several transmissions collapsed into one repeating loop. That alone changes the direction of the mission, because suddenly this isn't just about survival anymore. It's about retrieval, about finding out what happened to whoever was still transmitting from inside that zone. The decision to move forward doesn't come from confidence. It comes from pressure. External systems are failing, extraction windows are narrowing, and the environment itself is becoming less predictable with every passing hour. That's when the film starts to slowly tighten its grip. As the group moves deeper into the Badlands, the landscape begins to shift in subtle but unsettling ways. It's not a sudden transformation. It's gradual enough that at first you question whether you're imagining it. The terrain becomes more structured, almost as if something has been intentionally shaped rather than naturally formed. Narrow passages appear where there shouldn't be any. Rock formations align in patterns that feel too deliberate, and sound behaves strangely, echoing in ways that don't match the geography. And all of it feels watched, not in a supernatural sense, but in a calculated, observational sense, like something is mapping them in real time. This is where the predator presence starts to evolve beyond simple stalking. Instead of just appearing as isolated moments of tension, it starts influencing the environment indirectly. The group begins encountering traps that don't feel random, not the classic jungle snares or improvised human defenses, but something more advanced and more alien in logic. Energy-based disturbances that disrupt electronics. Silent zones where communication drops entirely. Areas where movement itself becomes disorienting because every directional reference point feels subtly off. It's not just hunting them, it's shaping their movement. And that's when paranoia starts to set in within the group dynamic. One of the interesting choices in how this story unfolds is that trust deteriorates long before the predator ever fully reveals itself. People start questioning whether the failures they're experiencing are environmental, technological, or intentional sabotage from within their own team. There's a slow breakdown of certainty, and that breakdown is more dangerous than any physical threat at first. Because once people stop trusting their instruments, they start trusting instinct. And instinct, in this environment, is unreliable. There's a moment where they find what appears to be a secondary crash site deeper in the Badlands. It's partially buried, warped by heat and pressure, but still recognizable as part of a larger fleet structure. This is where the story starts hinting at something bigger than a single expedition gone wrong. This wasn't an isolated event. Multiple groups have been drawn here over time, and none of them seem to have left in a coordinated way. Inside the wreckage, there are signs of both human and non-human interaction. Structural damage that doesn't align with known weapon systems, but also defensive markings, human attempts to hold position, to fortify, to survive against something they clearly didn't understand. And then they find the first real sign that changes everything. A preserved recording device, not fully intact, but enough to extract fragments. What comes through isn't clean exposition. It's broken, overlapping voices, panic, tactical commands that don't make sense together, and beneath it, something else. An audio pattern that doesn't belong to any human speaker, layered underneath like a constant presence in the background of the transmission. That sound becomes important later, because it's not just noise, it's recognition. The group doesn't realize it yet, but they've already been identified. This is where the predator shifts from passive presence to active engagement. The attacks don't come in full force, they come in tests. Isolated strikes designed to measure reaction time, decision-making, group cohesion. One member of the team is separated under controlled conditions that don't feel accidental anymore. Paths that seemed connected earlier suddenly loop back on themselves. Navigation tools begin to give inconsistent readings, forcing reliance on visual memory and terrain interpretation alone. And that's where things start to break down further. Because in environments like this, human perception becomes the weakest system in play. There's a sequence where the team tries to regroup after a separation event, only to realize they've been circling the same formation for hours without noticing it. The realization doesn't come from external confirmation. It comes from fatigue, from subtle inconsistencies in footprints, discarded gear appearing in places it shouldn't. That's when they understand they are not simply being hunted in space. They are being manipulated in movement, and somewhere above or around them, the predator is no longer just observing individually, it's anticipating as a system. The final stretch of this part of the story leans into that tension heavily. The environment becomes almost labyrinth-like without ever physically changing. It's perception that shifts, not geography. And that makes every decision feel unreliable. Even the character relationships begin to fracture under this pressure. Small disagreements escalate quickly. Orders are questioned. Leadership becomes meaningless because authority depends on certainty, and certainty no longer exists. And just when it feels like the group might collapse under its own instability, there's a brief, chilling moment of clarity. They realize the predator hasn't been randomly engaging them at all. It has been isolating variables, breaking the group down into individual components, testing who survives alone, and that realization lands just as the first full, unmistakable visual confirmation of the predator appears again. Still distant, still partially obscured, but now undeniably intentional in its positioning. Not attacking, not rushing, just waiting for the next stage of whatever this has become to unfold. By the time the group fully understands they're being studied, not just hunted, something in the dynamic shifts in a way that's hard to reverse. It stops being about escape routes and starts becoming about patterns, because once you realize every wrong turn might actually be the intended turn, you lose the comfort of making decisions altogether. And that's exactly where Badlands starts tightening the psychological screw. The environment doesn't change dramatically, but it begins to feel less like terrain and more like intention. A corridor that felt open earlier suddenly feels narrower when you return to it. A ridge that looked random now appears structured, almost like it's part of a larger observational grid. Even the wind feels inconsistent, like it's being redirected in unnatural currents that don't match the geography. One of the surviving members, someone who initially came across as the most grounded, likely with prior field experience, starts noticing something that the others dismiss at first: repetition in environmental features. Not identical objects, but similar arrangements. Rock clusters forming mirrored angles across vast distances. Scratches and markings that appear too evenly spaced to be accidental. At first, it's brushed off as pattern recognition bias. The kind of thing stressed minds do when they're trying to impose order on chaos. But the problem is, the patterns don't stop. They escalate. And the predator, without ever fully revealing itself, starts to feel less like a singular entity and more like an intelligence distributed across the landscape. That's where the film's tension becomes more sophisticated than typical chase horror structure. Because instead of monster appears, group runs, it becomes system adjusts, group is evaluated. There's a sequence where the team attempts to use a drone-like survey device to map their surroundings more accurately. It's a small moment, but it carries weight because it represents their last attempt at reclaiming control through technology. The device launches successfully, rising above the terrain, feeding back clean data for a few seconds. And for that brief window, everything looks normal again. Flat mapping, clear coordinates, a world that can be understood. Then the signal degrades, not by interference in the traditional sense, but by something that seems to respond to the drone's presence. The feed begins to fragment. Not static. Fragmentation, like reality itself, is being reinterpreted in real time. The image splits into layers. Terrain doesn't just blur, it shifts position slightly between frames, and in those shifts, something else appears, not fully visible, but present. The drone is gone within seconds after that. But what matters more is the implication. Whatever is out there can interact with observation itself. That changes the stakes completely, because now even watching becomes dangerous. The group stops relying on aerial data after that. And once that happens, they're forced back into pure ground-level survival logic. No broader perspective, no external confirmation, just immediate surroundings and memory. And memory under stress is unreliable. This is where the predator's strategy becomes clearer without ever being explained directly. It doesn't rush kills. It reduces certainty. Every encounter is designed to remove something from the group's ability to function cohesively. First technology, then trust in terrain, then trust in each other. There's a moment that hits harder than most action sequences because it isn't about violence, it's about misalignment. Two members of the group, trying to regroup after being separated, encounter each other in a narrow rock corridor. At first, it feels like relief, but something is off. Neither of them is fully confident the other made it there untracked, and the hesitation grows just long enough that you can feel the tension shift from survival to suspicion. No one fires immediately, and that hesitation is what makes the situation dangerous. Because in that silence, the predator doesn't need to intervene. The environment already did most of the work. A distant movement, a sound misinterpreted, a shadow cast at the wrong angle, and suddenly trust collapses faster than any physical attack could have achieved. After that, the group fragments further, not just physically, but psychologically. Communication becomes minimal. Signals are shortened. Eye contact is avoided unless necessary. The shared goal of survival is still there, but it's been fractured into individual interpretations of what survival even means. Some believe staying together increases risk. Others believe separation guarantees death. Neither side is fully wrong. That's what makes it worse. Deeper into the Badlands, the story introduces something that feels like a turning point, but doesn't announce itself as one. They come across a structure that is neither fully natural nor fully artificial. It doesn't match the crashed human tech aesthetic, and it doesn't resemble known predator design language either. It feels older, not just physically, but conceptually, like it predates both groups. The structure emits a faint, almost imperceptible energy signature that disrupts their equipment even before they enter. Compasses drift. Visual calibration systems misalign slightly. Audio picks up low-frequency distortions that seem to pulse in a non-random rhythm. Inside, the space is hollow, layered with geometric precision that feels almost ritualistic, but not in a human sense. There are no clear indicators of purpose, no storage, no machinery, just space designed in a way that suggests observation or containment. This is where the group starts to question whether the predator is truly the apex presence here, or just another participant in something larger.
By the time the Badlands stops feeling like a location and starts feeling like a controlled system, the survivors are already past the point of clean recovery. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that sets in here. Not physical at first, but cognitive. The kind where every new piece of information doesn't clarify anything. It just adds another layer of doubt on top of what already exists. And that's exactly what this environment seems designed to produce. Even the smallest decisions become heavy. Turning left or right isn't just navigation anymore. It feels like it might be participating in something larger that they don't understand. And when that kind of thinking starts creeping in, people stop acting like a team and start acting like individuals trying to avoid being the next variable removed from the equation. At this point, the predator isn't just a presence anymore. It's a rhythm.
You start noticing how its influence aligns with moments of hesitation. It doesn't always attack when people are moving. It waits for pauses, for uncertainty, for those split seconds where a decision could go either way. That's when things tend to happen. Not always violence, sometimes just displacement, a missing supply pack, a broken communication line, a path that no longer leads where it did before. It's almost like the entire environment has learned how they think. And that's the most unsettling part. One of the remaining group members starts documenting this informally, not in a structured log, but in fragmented notes, scribbles, directional marks, time inconsistencies. And what becomes obvious over time is that their internal sense of duration is no longer reliable. Hours feel compressed in some areas, stretched in others. Rest periods don't align with environmental cues like light or temperature shifts. It's subtle, but it's enough to destabilize their ability to plan, because planning requires trust in time. And time here is behaving like it's being observed. There's a sequence where they attempt to establish a fixed camp again, a point of stability in the middle of the shifting terrain. It feels almost hopeful at first. They use markers, physical anchors, anything that can resist environmental disorientation. For a brief period, it works. They regain structure, they regain communication, they even begin to reassign roles, trying to restore the hierarchy that broke down earlier. But the Badlands doesn't allow stability to persist. The next morning, or what they believe is morning, the markers are no longer where they left them. Not removed, not destroyed, just subtly repositioned. Enough to disrupt orientation, enough to make confidence collapse again. And that's when paranoia becomes the dominant survival mechanism. People stop agreeing on shared reality, not because they are irrational, but because each of them is experiencing inconsistencies that don't align with anyone else's account. One person insists a corridor looped, another insists it was straight. Both have evidence that feels correct in isolation, but incompatible when compared. The predator's presence becomes less about physical sightings and more about interpretive conflict. And that's arguably more dangerous than any attack. Because once a group can't agree on what happened, they can't coordinate around what's coming next. There's a moment that stands out because it's almost quiet enough to miss in a different kind of film. One of the survivors, moving alone for a short distance, begins hearing something that isn't immediately identifiable as external. At first, it sounds like environmental resonance, wind passing through fractured stone. But it slowly resolves into something structured, almost rhythmic, almost intentional. It takes a while before it's recognized as the same layered audio pattern that appeared in the corrupted transmission earlier. Which means one thing, it's not random. It's repeating. Or worse, it's being replicated. That realization changes the emotional tone of everything that follows, because now even sound isn't trustworthy as environmental background. It's part of the system. When they regroup again, It's less a reunion and more a collision of exhausted interpretations. Nobody is fully convinced of their own conclusions anymore, and that erosion of certainty is exactly what the predator seems to be building toward, because the next stage doesn't involve direct confrontation, it involves conditioning. The group begins encountering spaces that feel intentionally staged, not traps in the traditional sense, but scenarios designed to force decisions under pressure. Narrow passages that open into branching paths with no clear advantage. Supply drops placed just far enough apart that reaching one requires leaving another vulnerable. Environmental hazards that activate only when movement reaches certain thresholds. It starts to feel less like hunting and more like problem design. And that's when one of the characters voices something that no one wants to fully acknowledge. What if this isn't random survival territory at all? What if the Badlands is structured, tested even? The idea lands poorly, not because it's unbelievable, but because it suggests intention beyond survival. That implication makes everything worse, because if there's intention, then there's purpose. And if there's purpose, then they are not just prey. They are participants. This shift in thinking leads to the first major fracture in strategy. One subgroup begins advocating for aggressive movement, forcing confrontation, trying to break whatever system is controlling the environment by pushing deeper and faster. Another subgroup argues for stillness, minimizing exposure, waiting for the system to reveal its cycle so it can be predicted. Neither approach is clearly correct, and that ambiguity is exactly what keeps them trapped. As they push further, the terrain begins to reflect their internal division. Areas they pass through start to feel like responses to their decisions. Aggressive movement leads to harsher environmental resistance. Slower, cautious movement leads to prolonged periods of psychological pressure, where silence and isolation become almost suffocating. It feels less like exploration and more like feedback. And through all of this, the predator remains intermittently visible, but never fully engaged in direct confrontation for extended periods. It appears more like punctuation than presence, a reminder that whatever system they are inside of, it still has an observer. At one point, there's a brief but critical encounter where the predator is seen interacting with the environment in a way that doesn't involve hunting at all. It's adjusting something. Not machinery in the human sense, but environmental structure. Like it understands how the Badlands functions at a level the humans never will. That single moment reframes everything again. Because it suggests hierarchy. Not predator and prey, but operator and subject. The survivors don't see the full implications of this immediately, but the audience does. And that gap in understanding becomes part of the tension. The deeper they go, the more the Badlands feels like it's compressing around them. Not physically, but conceptually. Fewer options, fewer reliable paths, fewer moments where action feels clearly defined. And that's where the psychological breakdown becomes unavoidable. Sleep becomes fragmented. Communication becomes minimal. Even decision-making slows because every option feels like it carries hidden consequences that can't be fully evaluated. And still, no one fully retreats. Because retreat implies understanding where back actually is. And in this environment, even that concept has been eroded. The final stretch of this part leaves the group standing at the edge of a massive geological formation that doesn't behave like natural erosion. It's structured in a way that suggests layered construction over time, almost like different phases of alteration have occurred, each one slightly changing the function of the space. And at the center of it, faint but undeniable, is the sense that they are no longer navigating outward. They are being guided inward, not by choice, but by design they still don't fully understand. By the time they realize the movement pattern isn't random anymore, it's already too late to call it exploration. It's navigation, not theirs. Something else is drawing them deeper into the Badlands, but the most unsettling part is how gradual it feels. No single moment of force, no obvious push, just a steady reduction of alternatives until every remaining path seems like it leads in the same direction anyway. That's when the group stops arguing about where to go and starts arguing about why they're still being allowed to choose at all. And that question hangs in the air for a long time without an answer. The terrain begins to change in a way that finally breaks its illusion of natural formation. It stops being just jagged rock and eroded plateaus. Patterns emerge that feel almost infrastructural, not buildings, not ruins in the traditional sense, but structural logic embedded into the landscape itself. Angles that repeat across distances that shouldn't allow repetition. Channels carved in ways that guide movement without making it obvious they're doing so. It's subtle enough that you could miss it if you weren't already suspicious. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's the turning point where the Badlands stops behaving like a place and starts behaving like a system with intent. One of the survivors finally puts together something that shifts the entire tone of what's left of the group dynamic. The environmental anomalies they've been experiencing, the shifting markers, the inconsistent time perception, the directional loops, aren't random malfunctions. They align too consistently with moments of decision-making pressure. Whenever the group hesitates, the environment changes. Whenever they commit, it responds, not always in a hostile way. Sometimes it corrects. That word becomes the problem, because correction implies an expected outcome, and expected outcome implies observation. That realization lands heavily, especially on the more analytical members of the group. What they thought was survival terrain starts to feel more like a controlled observation field, not designed to kill immediately, but to study behavioral responses under stress. And then the predator stops being just a hunter in their interpretation. It becomes something closer to an evaluator. There's a sequence that doesn't rely on action at all, and it might be one of the most important emotional pivots in the story. The group encounters a wide, open basin in the Badlands, where visibility is unusually clear. No distortion, no environmental interference. For the first time in a long while, things feel almost normal. That feeling is the trap. Because clarity here doesn't mean safety. It means exposure, and they realize it too late. The predator doesn't attack immediately. Instead, it circles the perimeter of perception. It remains just outside full visibility, moving in and out of sight lines, never committing to a direct confrontation. It's almost like it's testing whether the group will break formation under certainty rather than fear. And they do, not all at once, but individually. One member attempts to break away, convinced that remaining in the basin increases risk. Another argues that movement into the surrounding terrain guarantees isolation. The disagreement escalates quickly because both positions are logically defensible based on their previous experiences, and that's what makes it collapse. Because when both survival instincts are valid but incompatible, coordination becomes impossible. The predator doesn't need to intervene much here. The environment itself starts to respond to divergence. Paths subtly shift. Exit points narrow. Sound becomes directional in a way that isolates individuals even when they're physically close. It feels like the space is learning how to separate them more efficiently. And then it happens. A moment of direct contact, not prolonged, not cinematic in the traditional sense, but sharp and disorienting. One of the survivors sees the predator at close range for the first time without obstruction. And what's different here isn't just the visual design, but the behavior. There's no rush, no frenzy, no wasted motion. It observes with the kind of stillness that feels almost clinical. Not anger, not aggression, assessment. That's what makes it worse than earlier encounters, because it confirms what the group has been afraid to articulate. They are not being chased in panic. They are being measured. After this encounter, the psychological breakdown accelerates. The group doesn't just fragment physically. They begin to lose shared interpretation of events entirely. Two people can witness the same occurrence and walk away describing fundamentally different realities of what happened, and neither of them is fully wrong. The Badlands is no longer just distorting perception. It's layering experiences in a way that makes consensus impossible. This is where the story shifts into its most isolating phase. Individuals begin operating alone even when they are technically still near each other. Communication becomes minimal, almost ritualistic. Short phrases, signals instead of conversations. Anything longer than necessary risks contradiction. And contradiction here is dangerous, because contradiction leads to hesitation. And hesitation is exactly what the system seems to respond to most efficiently. There's a sequence where one of the characters tries to map the terrain manually, ignoring all unreliable tech. They carve markers into stone, track movement by physical landmarks, attempt to rebuild a stable internal reference system. But even that begins to fail, because the landmarks themselves are not consistent across time. What was once a reliable reference point becomes something that shifts subtly depending on approach angle, not moving in obvious ways, but enough to make memory unreliable, enough to make confidence degrade. And as confidence degrades, the predator's presence becomes more frequent again. Not louder, just closer. Always closer. There's a moment late in this segment where the group briefly reconvenes, not because they planned to, but because the environment forces convergence. Paths narrow, options reduce. Movement funnels them into the same space whether they intended or not. And that's when the truth becomes harder to ignore. They are not being hunted across terrain. They are being processed through it. The predator appears again, but this time it doesn't even fully reveal itself. Only partial glimpses, reflections, movement behind structures that weren't there moments before. It's less about visibility now and more about inevitability. The sense that whatever outcome is coming has already been accounted for. And that realization changes something in the survivors. Fear is still present, but it's no longer the dominant emotion. It's resignation mixed with resistance. Because even if the system is designed to evaluate them, there's still a human impulse to refuse being reduced to a variable. And that tension between being observed and refusing to be defined is what carries them into the final stretch of this phase of the story, where survival stops being about escape and starts becoming about whether resistance itself has any meaning inside something that already seems to have calculated every possible outcome. By the time resistance becomes the only thing left that still feels human, the Badlands has already stopped behaving like an environment in any normal sense of the word. It feels more like a closed argument that won't let anyone leave until it's finished with them. And the remaining survivors, what's left of them, aren't really moving with a shared objective anymore. They're moving because standing still feels even more dangerous. That's the strange shift that happens when survival turns abstract. Motion becomes instinct, not strategy. The landscape tightens again, but not in a way that's physically obvious. It's more like the space between decisions is shrinking. Every choice has less breathing room. Every hesitation feels like it echoes longer than it should. Even silence starts to feel structured, as if it has placement. At this stage, the predator's presence stops being something they react to and starts becoming something they anticipate. And anticipation is worse than surprise, because anticipation never fully resolves. One of the survivors begins to notice something that changes the emotional direction of everything that follows. The predator's appearances are not random sightings. They correlate with emotional spikes inside the group. Fear, conflict, hesitation, separation. It always seems to align with internal breakdowns rather than external movement. That realization creates a dangerous idea. What if the predator isn't just tracking bodies? What if it's tracking decision states? Not just where they go, but how they choose to go there. That thought spreads quietly through the group. Not spoken aloud at first, because saying it out loud makes it harder to dismiss. It implies that their psychological condition is part of the hunting process. And if that's true, then every argument, every doubt, every moment of panic is not just weakness, it's input. From that point forward, even thinking feels compromised. There's a moment where they encounter what looks like a boundary shift in the Badlands, a section of terrain where everything abruptly changes tone. The rock formations become smoother, more intentional. The wind drops almost completely. Even ambient sound feels dampened, like the space itself is isolating them from the rest of the world. It feels wrong in a way they can't immediately explain, and that's usually when it's already too late. The group moves into it cautiously, but caution here doesn't help. The environment begins to behave like a controlled chamber. Distances feel longer than they should. Landmarks lose consistency from different angles. Even walking straight becomes something that requires correction, like the space resists linear movement, and the predator becomes more present again. Not visually dominant, not constantly visible, but closer in a way that's undeniable. This is where the film shifts into something closer to a psychological pressure test than a survival narrative, because the predator stops attacking directly for long stretches. Instead, it lets conditions build. It lets the environment do the work, and when it does act, it's almost surgical. Minimal motion, maximum disruption, not to eliminate immediately, but to destabilize remaining structure. one of the more grounded survivors, someone who has been trying to maintain some form of rational analysis throughout, starts breaking down their own conclusions in real time. They realize that every system they've tried to impose on the Badlands has failed, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. The environment doesn't just react, it adapts to interpretation. That's the most disturbing part, because it suggests intelligence not in aggression, but in comprehension. And once that idea is introduced, everything else starts to reframe itself. The predator isn't just adapting to them, it's learning how they interpret reality and using that interpretation against them. There's a sequence where the group attempts a coordinated push out of the narrowing zone, trying to break what they believe is a containment field forming around them. For the first time in a while, there's unity in action, not confidence, but necessity. They move together, and for a brief moment, it feels like they might actually outpace the system. But that feeling doesn't last, because the Badlands responds not by blocking them physically, but by breaking synchronization. Communication begins to degrade in timing. Signals arrive slightly delayed. Visual confirmation doesn't match auditory cues. Even footsteps feel desynchronized across group members, as if each person is experiencing a slightly different version of the same movement. And that's when cohesion collapses again, not violently, just quietly, like a system losing phase alignment. And the predator, for the first time in a while, is clearly present during this collapse, not attacking, just observing the breakdown with that same stillness that feels less like hunting and more like confirmation. It's not checking if they will survive. It's checking how they fail. That's the distinction that starts to define everything now. The group doesn't fully notice the shift in time perception until much later, but it becomes clear in retrospect that entire stretches of their journey are missing continuity. Not erased, not forgotten, just impossible to place in sequence. Like events are still happening, but not in a stable order. That realization breaks something fundamental in their ability to plan. Because planning requires sequence, and sequence no longer feels reliable. By this point, the predator is no longer just a threat in the field. It has become a reference point for instability. Every anomaly, every inconsistency, every shift in perception is indirectly attributed to its presence, whether or not it is physically seen. And that creates a new kind of fear. Not fear of attack, fear of interpretation. Because now, even understanding what is happening might be part of the trap. The final stretch of this segment brings everything into a tighter, almost claustrophobic focus. The terrain feels compressed, movement options are reduced. The group is no longer exploring outward, they are being funneled inward, toward a central region that feels less like a destination and more like a conclusion. And through it all, the predator remains just out of full clarity, never fully revealed for long, always partially understood, because full understanding would end the uncertainty. And uncertainty is what keeps them moving. The last moments of this section leave them standing at the edge of what feels like a final structural shift in the Badlands, a zone where everything previously experienced converges into something denser, more intentional, and far less forgiving.
What happens next doesn't feel like a new location so much as a collapse of whatever illusion of distance they still had left. The moment they cross into this deeper region of the Badlands, the air itself feels different. Not colder, not hotter, just heavier in a way that makes every movement slightly more deliberate. Even breathing starts to feel like it has resistance. And that's when the last illusion of being guided turns into something far more unsettling. Because there's no longer any sense that they are being led forward. It feels like they've already arrived, just not consciously yet. The terrain here is almost eerily structured in its consistency. Not natural variation, not chaotic erosion patterns, but something closer to repetition with intent. The same angular formations appear at inconsistent distances, like someone designed the landscape using rules that are just slightly beyond human comprehension.
And the survivors notice something else now, that they've lost enough certainty to actually see it clearly. There are no real dead ends, only returns. Every path loops, or folds, or recontextualizes itself depending on how it's approached. It's not a maze designed to confuse movement. It's a system designed to observe decision-making under controlled repetition. That realization lands harder than any physical threat they've faced so far, because it means every choice they've made hasn't been about progress. It's been about reaction patterns. And somewhere inside that system, something has been watching how they behave when they think they are making progress. The predator's presence becomes less frequent visually now, but far more integrated into the environment itself. It's no longer a figure that appears and disappears. It feels embedded, like it exists in the gaps between perception rather than within it. At one point, one of the survivors stops and just listens, not to sounds of movement, not to wind, but to absence. Because the absence here is not neutral. It feels structured. Like silence has been placed intentionally in specific regions to create contrast with others. That kind of design doesn't belong to chance. And that's when the group begins to realize something that shifts everything again. They are not alone in a space being observed. They are inside a space that is actively responding to observation. There's a difference, a small one in language, a massive one in consequence. The group tries to push forward again, but forward has lost meaning in a place where orientation is no longer stable. Even the idea of direction begins to degrade. North, south, up, down. These concepts start to feel like suggestions rather than facts. And in that degradation, tension becomes internal again. Arguments don't escalate loudly anymore. They dissolve into short exchanges, incomplete sentences, interrupted thoughts. Everyone is trying to maintain some version of personal certainty because shared certainty is gone. And that's exactly when the predator reasserts itself, not as a visible hunter, but as a correction. One member of the group moves slightly ahead of the others and disappears from immediate sightline for only a few seconds. No sound of struggle, no clear indication of attack, just absence. When the others reach that point, there's no confrontation waiting. Only rearrangement. The environment around the disappearance point has subtly shifted. Not destroyed, not marked, just altered enough that returning the same way becomes uncertain. It doesn't feel like violence, it feels like editing. And that's worse, because it suggests every removal is not emotional or reactive, but functional. The group doesn't speak about it directly afterward. There's no space for discussion anymore. Everything is becoming too compressed to support explanation. Only continuation. They move again. But now, movement itself feels like compliance. At some point deeper in this section, they encounter what appears to be a vertical structure rising out of the Badlands. Something partially natural, partially artificial, but so deeply integrated into the surrounding terrain that separating the two becomes impossible. It's not a building in the traditional sense. It's more like a geological anomaly that behaves like architecture, and it radiates that same quiet distortion they've been experiencing throughout, but intensified. Inside, everything changes again. The sound dampening increases, visual perception narrows slightly, edges feel sharper, like the environment is increasing focus on whatever enters it. And for the first time, the predator is not just present in fragments. It's consistent, not fully visible in every moment, but undeniably closer to physical interaction than before. The behavior changes too. Less testing, more alignment, as if whatever threshold was being measured externally has now been satisfied internally. The group realizes, too late, that entering this structure wasn't accidental. It was a transition from observation space to engagement space. And once that realization settles in, the tone shifts from survival uncertainty to something closer to inevitability. There's a moment where they attempt to retreat, but the structure does not respond to backward movement the same way it responded to entry. Paths that were open begin to feel misaligned. Routes that were clear on entry become inconsistent on exit. The geometry itself feels slightly out of phase with memory, and that's when panic starts to return, but not as chaos, as recognition, because they understand now that escape is no longer part of the system being evaluated. Inside, they begin finding remnants that don't belong to their expedition. Not human remains in a traditional sense, but signs of prior cycles. Equipment that looks partially familiar, but altered in ways that suggest adaptation. Not abandoned, but processed, which implies something even more disturbing. They are not the first group here, and none of the previous groups left in a way that preserved coherence. The predator appears again in this environment, but differently now. It doesn't just observe or test. It moves with purpose that feels synchronized with the structure itself. Like the structure and the entity are no longer separate systems. And that forces a new interpretation that none of them want to fully accept. What if the predator isn't operating in the Badlands? What if it is part of how the Badlands operates? That idea fractures what's left of their psychological stability, because it removes the final assumption they were relying on, that there is still a hunter and a hunted dynamic that can be understood and possibly escaped. Instead, it suggests integration, that they are inside something that includes the predator as a functioning component, not an intruder, not an anomaly, but a role. And roles in systems like this are not optional. As they move deeper into the structure, the boundaries between internal and external space begin to dissolve further. Corridors feel less like constructed paths and more like extensions of perception. Movement feels less like navigation and more like compliance with spatial logic they don't fully understand. And through all of this, the predator remains present, not as a single entity, but as a constant variable in the system's response to them. Not chasing, not waiting, just continuing its function. And by the time they reach the deepest accessible point in this segment, there is no longer any sense that they are approaching an end point, only that they are approaching a phase transition in whatever the Badlands actually is. And what comes after that transition is no longer framed as survival. It feels like evaluation reaching completion. At this point, the Badlands stops behaving like something you can go deeper into and starts feeling like something you've already been fully absorbed by. You just didn't realize when that line got crossed. The structure they've entered doesn't have a clear interior anymore in the way human intuition expects. It's not rooms, not corridors, not even a consistent layout. It feels more like moving through layers of a system that keeps reinterpreting itself as they pass through it. What was a wall a moment ago becomes an open passage depending on angle, timing, and even attention. And that detail, attention, is where everything becomes uncomfortable, because it starts to feel like the environment responds differently when it is directly observed versus when it is assumed. The survivors don't say it out loud, but they're all starting to notice it in different ways. If they look directly at a space too long, it stabilizes. If they move quickly without focusing, it shifts. It's not consistent enough to prove easily, but consistent enough to make everyone second guess how they're perceiving reality itself. That's when fear becomes internalized in a new form. Not fear of attack, fear of misperception. The predator, at this stage, doesn't need to dominate the space physically. It already has influence through the instability of interpretation. It appears only in controlled fragments, never fully committing to presence unless conditions align. And those conditions almost always involve emotional or cognitive overload within the group. One of the survivors finally breaks down the pattern they've been subconsciously following. Every time they make a confident decision, the environment responds with resistance shortly after. Every time they hesitate or disagree, the system seems to open slightly, almost as if uncertainty is part of what allows navigation forward. That realization changes behavior immediately. Now they start second-guessing confidence itself. And that is exactly the kind of internal collapse the system seems designed to produce. The deeper chamber they reach next feels less like architecture and more like a constructed memory. The walls aren't just structured, they carry faint impressions, like residual traces of prior events. Not visuals in a literal sense, but suggestive distortions that make it feel like something happened here repeatedly over time. Not once, not accidentally, repeatedly. That's when the implication becomes unavoidable. This isn't the first cycle of occupation. The predator isn't the first observer. And this Badlands system, whatever it truly is, has processed multiple groups before them, each one leaving behind less clarity than the last. Inside this chamber, the group encounters a central open space that feels deliberately arranged, not symmetrical, but balanced in a way that doesn't match natural formation. The ground texture subtly changes as they enter, becoming more uniform, almost like a surface designed to register movement rather than resist it. And for the first time, the predator doesn't just appear at the edge of perception. It steps fully into controlled visibility, not in aggression, not in chaos, but in presence, still, observing, close enough that denial is no longer possible. The silence that follows isn't environmental. It's psychological, because every survivor understands at the same time that this moment isn't an ambush. It's a point of assessment. The predator's posture is different here too, less reactive, more deliberate. There's no rush, no instinctive movement. Everything about it feels aligned with the structure around them, as if it is not entering the space, but continuing within it. That alignment breaks something in the group's understanding, Because if the predator belongs here in a functional sense, then the idea of escape becomes meaningless. You don't escape something you are already inside of. One of the survivors attempts to act anyway, part reflex, part desperation. But the response is immediate in a way that doesn't feel like violence so much as correction. Not an explosion of force, but a precise interruption. The action never fully completes. It's stopped before it becomes outcome. And that's when the group understands something crucial. The predator doesn't need to finish engagements here. It only needs to prevent divergence from expected results. Everything else is already accounted for. After that moment, movement becomes minimal. Not because they are safe, but because action itself feels increasingly irrelevant. The system no longer seems interested in their survival responses. It's observing something else now. Consistency of behavior under full awareness of observation. The group begins to fracture in a quieter way than before. Not through argument or disagreement, but through withdrawal. Each person starts internalizing their interpretation of what is happening, no longer trying to reconcile it with others. Shared reality finally dissolves completely, and the predator remains, not as pursuer, but as constant evaluator. At one point, the structure begins to shift again, but this time more noticeably. The chamber responds to their positions. Paths open and close not randomly, but in correlation with collective movement patterns. When they stand together, the space stabilizes. When they separate, it becomes unpredictable again. That's when the most unsettling interpretation emerges without being spoken aloud. The system isn't just studying individuals, it is studying group coherence, and breaking it is part of the process. The predator appears again briefly, but this time its behavior suggests recognition rather than pursuit. Not recognition of identity, but recognition of state. As if it is tracking completion levels in a process that is nearing its end. There's no indication of mercy or hostility in it, only function. And that function feels like it is approaching finalization. The survivors reach a final threshold point within this structure where movement stops feeling voluntary entirely. It's not that they are restrained physically, it's that every direction feels equally viable and equally meaningless at the same time. Choice loses weight because outcome variance collapses, and in that collapse, the predator becomes almost still, permanently visible for extended stretches. Not attacking, not retreating, just present in a way that suggests the system no longer requires concealment, because concealment was never the point. At this stage, it becomes clear that whatever the Badlands is, it has moved beyond hunting. It is conducting closure, and the survivors, what remains of them, are no longer participants in a survival scenario. They are components in a completed observation cycle that is waiting for final confirmation before resetting or transitioning. And the last thing that lingers isn't fear anymore. It's the uncomfortable realization that they were never navigating a world. They were moving through a process that already knew how it would end long before they arrived. At the point where everything feels like it has stabilized into inevitability, something in the Badlands changes again, but not in the way it has before. This time, it doesn't shift around them. It shifts through them. The survivors begin noticing a subtle divergence in perception that is no longer tied to environment alone. It's internal now. Two people can be standing in the same exact position, looking at the same exact space, and describe slightly different geometries, not dramatically different, just enough to make agreement impossible without doubt creeping in. And that's when the final layer of the system reveals itself without ever announcing that it is doing so. The structure they're inside stops feeling like a place entirely and starts feeling like a feedback loop. Every observation they make reinforces a slightly altered version of reality. Every decision refines that version, and every moment of hesitation introduces instability that the system immediately corrects, not with force, but with adjustment. It's not punishing them, it's converging them. The predator is still present, but its role has changed in a way that reframes everything that came before. It is no longer acting as an independent hunter operating within the environment. It is functioning more like a stabilizing agent, a constant, a reference point, something that ensures the system doesn't drift outside of acceptable parameters. And once that realization settles in, the emotional foundation of everything collapses into something quieter than fear. It becomes understanding without consent. One of the survivors finally speaks it out loud, not in a dramatic revelation, but in a tired, fractured observation that feels like it's been building for a long time. This isn't a hunt, it's calibration. The words don't change anything immediately, but they land differently than anything else has. Because they don't try to explain survival, they redefine purpose, and in doing so, they remove the illusion that there was ever a way out in the traditional sense. The chamber they are in begins to respond more actively now. Subtle shifts in structure become more synchronized with their collective behavior. When they move in alignment, the space stabilizes. When they diverge, it fragments, not violently, but noticeably enough that even denial becomes difficult to maintain. The predator appears again, closer than before, and for the first time, there is a sense that it is not just observing outcomes, it is confirming them, not judging, not reacting, confirming. And that difference is everything, because it suggests the outcome is already known and the process is just verification. One of the survivors attempts something desperate at this stage, not an attack, but a refusal, a break in pattern, moving in a direction that contradicts every prior instinct and environmental cue. It's not strategic, it's emotional, a rejection of predictability itself. For a brief moment, nothing happens. No immediate correction, no environmental shift, no predator response. And that silence is more frightening than resistance, because it suggests the system is evaluating whether deviation is still possible. Then the structure responds, not abruptly, but comprehensively. The chamber reorganizes in a way that feels less like movement and more like redefinition. Paths no longer simply open or close, they reassign meaning. What was forward becomes lateral. What was escape becomes return. Orientation itself loses permanence, and the survivor who broke pattern realizes something in that moment that doesn't come as insight so much as recognition. The system doesn't prevent free will, it absorbs it. The predator finally steps fully into view in a way that feels different from all prior appearances. Not because it has changed visually, but because the context around it has changed. It is no longer emerging from shadows or distance. It is standing within a stabilized field of perception that no longer distorts around it. It looks less like an intruder and more like an embedded function. And for the first time, it doesn't move at all. It doesn't need to, because nothing in the system requires it to initiate anymore. The survivors begin to understand, too late, that their presence here was never about escape velocity or survival probability. It was about response mapping under controlled escalation. Every fear reaction, every coordination breakdown, every attempt at leadership, every moment of isolation, all of it has been recorded, compared, and integrated into a larger behavioral profile. And now that profile is complete. The Badlands doesn't feel like it is closing in. It feels like it is finishing a sentence it started long before they arrived. One by one, the remaining survivors stop attempting movement. Not because they are restrained, but because movement no longer produces meaningful change. The environment no longer reacts with variation. It reacts with confirmation. And confirmation removes uncertainty. Without uncertainty, action loses function. The predator remains in position, still not aggressive, still not reactive, but now undeniably central to the system's focus. Not as leader, not as antagonist, but as anchor. The point everything is measured against. And in that final realization, something becomes clear that reframes the entire Badlands experience from beginning to end. There was never a chase. There was only convergence. The final moments of this phase don't resolve with victory or defeat. There is no escape sequence, no climactic confrontation in the traditional sense. Instead, there is stabilization. The system reaches a state where all remaining variables have been accounted for. And once that happens, everything stops evolving. Not because it ends, but because it completes. The survivors are left in a space that feels neither hostile nor safe, just finalized, like a process that has finished running and is now waiting for interpretation rather than continuation. And the predator, still present, no longer feels like a participant in that outcome. It feels like proof that the outcome was always valid. What happens next is no longer framed as survival or even story progression. It feels like transition into something that was always there beneath the surface of everything they experienced. Finally exposed now that all variables have settled into place. And in that stillness, the Badlands stops being a place you move through. It becomes something that has already moved through you.
At this point, there isn't really a next step in the way the human mind expects progression to work. The Badlands doesn't escalate anymore. It locks in. Everything that has been building across the previous phases settles into a strange kind of still clarity, like a system that has stopped iterating and started finalizing. The survivors, what remains of them psychologically more than physically, are no longer reacting to fear in a traditional sense. Fear has already been processed too many times to produce a new outcome. Instead, what's left is a kind of detached awareness that every possible response has already been seen, tested, and accounted for somewhere inside the structure they are moving through. And that realization changes the emotional temperature completely. The environment feels quieter but not peaceful.
It feels resolved in a way that doesn't invite participation anymore. Even movement becomes optional in a strange sense, like the world isn't forcing them forward, but it also isn't acknowledging any alternative direction as meaningful. That's when the predator reappears again. But this time, it doesn't feel like an appearance. It feels like confirmation. There's no build-up, no stalking sequence, no tension curve designed around anticipation. It is simply there, already positioned within the space as if it has been there the entire time, and only now becomes visible because perception has finally aligned correctly. And that shift is important, because it reframes everything again, not as pursuit, not as observation, but as synchronization. The predator is no longer reacting to the survivor's behavior. The survivors are now reacting within a framework that already includes the predator as a constant state. It's not entering scenes anymore. It's revealing itself within them when conditions settle enough to make it perceptible. One of the remaining survivors tries to articulate what's happening, but language itself starts to fail in a subtle way, not in the sense of losing vocabulary, but in losing precision. Words feel too large or too small for what they're trying to describe. Everything becomes approximate, and approximation is dangerous in a system that depends on consistency, because inconsistency gets corrected, not punished. Corrected. The structure around them begins to simplify visually. The layered complexity of shifting geometry, inconsistent paths, and unstable landmarks starts to reduce into something far more minimal. Clean transitions, predictable reconfiguration, fewer surprises, which should feel like relief. But it doesn't. Because predictability here doesn't mean safety. It means completion of modeling. The system no longer needs to explore outcomes. It already has them. The group attempts one final coordinated push, but it's not driven by strategy anymore. It's driven by a last instinctive refusal to remain passive within something that feels like it has already decided what they are. They move, but the movement feels ceremonial rather than functional, like they are reenacting decision-making rather than actively influencing anything new. The predator watches without interruption, not intervening, not accelerating, just present as an unchanged reference point against which everything else stabilizes, and then something subtle happens that signals the true shift. The environment stops responding to movement entirely, not in resistance, not in adaptation, just non-response, as if the system has stopped recording variation. And in that silence of feedback, the survivors understand something that arrives too late to be useful, but too clear to ignore. They are no longer being evaluated for survival. They are being evaluated for completion. Every previous phase, confusion, fragmentation, isolation, adaptation, was not progression toward escape. It was progression toward resolution. The predator's role becomes clearer in this final framing, not as an enemy or ally, but as an invariant element that ensures the system remains anchored while everything else resolves around it. It does not need to act anymore because its function was already fulfilled earlier in the process. Now it simply exists within the completed structure. And the Badlands, as an entity, feels less like a terrain and more like a finished model of behavior under pressure. The survivors reach what feels like a final observational threshold. Not a door, not an exit, not a confrontation point, but a space where all prior logic converges and stops differentiating. And in that convergence, individuality begins to dissolve in a quiet way, not physically, conceptually, because when every decision leads to the same interpreted outcome, the idea of separate agency becomes less meaningful. The predator stands within that convergence point without changing posture, as if nothing about this stage requires deviation from its current state. And that is the last emotional inversion the story delivers in this phase, because at no point does it behave like a victor. It behaves like a constant, and constants do not win or lose. They define systems. The final moments leave everything suspended in that uncomfortable clarity, Not resolution through escape, not destruction through conflict, but completion through understanding that the system was never designed to end in motion. It was designed to end in recognition. And once recognition happens, the Badlands doesn't close. It simply stops needing to change. At this point, there isn't a traditional continuation the way a normal survival story would offer it. The Badlands has already moved past escalation, past confrontation, even past evaluation, in the way the survivors originally understood it. What's left feels like aftermath that is still actively happening. The space they're in holds steady in a way that's almost uncomfortable because stability was never part of the earlier experience. Every phase before this was defined by change, terrain shifts, perception distortions, fragmented encounters, unpredictable predator appearances. Now, none of that fluctuates anymore. The environment simply holds, and that holding feels intentional, like pressure that no longer increases, but also never releases. The survivors, what remains of them in terms of presence and awareness, begin to understand that the system is no longer testing responses. It's not adapting to behavior anymore. It has already compiled everything it needed from them. What follows now is something closer to processing than survival. There's a quiet realization that slowly spreads through what's left of the group dynamic. Nothing they do from this point forward is introducing new data. Every action, every hesitation, every attempt at interpretation is already inside the system's expected range, and that removes urgency in a way that doesn't feel freeing. It feels final. The predator is still there, but its role no longer reads as active engagement. It doesn't reposition, doesn't react, doesn't adjust. It remains within the field of perception like a fixed coordinate, unchanging, unquestioning, unaffected by the collapse of tension around it. That constancy starts to reframe everything one last time, because the survivors begin to understand that what they interpreted as pursuit was never about motion at all. It was about consistency under observation. And now that consistency has been fully mapped, nothing in the system needs to shift anymore. One of the survivors makes a final attempt to impose meaning on the situation, not through action, but through understanding. Trying to connect earlier anomalies, patterns, and behavioral responses into a coherent narrative that explains why they were brought here. But the problem isn't lack of information, it's excess. Everything fits too well. Every fragment they recall from earlier stages aligns into a structure that leaves no meaningful gaps. And when a system leaves no gaps, interpretation stops being exploration and starts becoming recognition of design. That's when the emotional weight of everything collapses into something quieter than fear or acceptance. It becomes acknowledgement without resolution. The Badlands doesn't reward understanding with escape routes. It doesn't punish misunderstanding with failure. It simply continues until interpretation stabilizes. And in this final stabilized state, even the idea of escape loses definition, because escape implies an external reference point, and there is no longer anything clearly external to reference. The structure they are in feels complete in a way that resists continuation, not because it is ending, but because it has reached a condition where continuation is unnecessary. The predator remains present through all of this, but its presence now feels almost archival, like it is part of the final recorded state rather than an active participant. It doesn't assert dominance or threaten outcome. It simply exists in alignment with the system's final configuration, and that alignment is what makes everything feel resolved. The survivors, individually now more than collectively, begin to experience a slow dissipation of urgency, not physical exhaustion, but cognitive settling. The need to interpret reduces because interpretation no longer produces variability. And without variability, thought itself becomes simpler. Not clearer. Simpler. The final impression the Badlands leaves is not of defeat or victory, but of completion of a cycle that was never framed correctly in survival terms to begin with. Everything that felt like hunting was structure. Everything that felt like chaos was calibration, and everything that felt like escalation was refinement toward a state where no further adjustment was required. The predator, unchanged, remains as the final reference point within that completed system, not as an ending, but as confirmation that the system is intact, stable, and no longer evolving. And in that stillness, the Badlands doesn't conclude. It just stops needing to explain itself. At this stage, there's no escalation left in the way the story used to understand escalation. What remains feels like a system that has already crossed its final threshold and is now operating in maintenance mode. Still active, still present, but no longer experimenting with outcomes. The survivors aren't really making decisions anymore in any meaningful sense. Even the idea of choice has started to feel like a leftover concept from earlier phases, something they remember having functioned differently, but can't fully recreate in practice. Movement happens, but it's no longer driven by intent. It's closer to inertia shaped by environment. When the space allows it, they move. When it resists, they stop. And over time, even resistance stops feeling like opposition and starts feeling like structure. The predator is still there, but its presence has fully transitioned into something static. It doesn't reposition in response to them anymore. It doesn't adjust its behavior based on their state. Instead, it remains positioned in a way that feels less like tracking and more like anchoring, like the system requires it to remain constant in order for everything else to remain readable. That idea starts to settle in quietly. The predator may not have been the hunter in the way they assumed at all. It may have been the fixed point everything else was measured against. And if that's true, then the entire interpretation of the Badlands shifts one last time. Because what looked like pursuit was actually calibration around a constant. What looked like survival was behavioral observation against a stable reference. And what looked like chaos was controlled variation inside a defined system boundary. The group, what's left of it, no longer argues or debates interpretations. Even disagreement requires energy that doesn't feel justified anymore. Instead, there's just shared silence that doesn't carry tension the way it used to. It carries acknowledgement. One of the survivors finally articulates something not as a discovery, but as a resignation shaped by clarity. Nothing they experienced here was random in the way they originally assumed, not because it was scripted in a narrative sense, but because it was structured in a functional sense. Every stage of confusion had a role. Every breakdown had a function. Every encounter had a purpose that only makes sense in hindsight once the system is viewed as a whole rather than in fragments. And now that the system is whole, there is nothing left for it to resolve. The environment reflects that shift in subtle ways, not visually dramatic, but in consistency. Distortions stop appearing. shifts stop occurring. Even the earlier sense of response to movement disappears entirely. It becomes a space that no longer reacts, because reaction implies ongoing evaluation, and evaluation has already concluded. There's a moment where one of them tries to retrace earlier logic, attempting to reconstruct meaning from the beginning. But the attempt falls apart quickly, not because the memory is gone, but because it no longer connects to anything dynamic. It feels like reading something already finalized, where reinterpretation doesn't produce new understanding, just confirmation of what has already been decided. And that is the final psychological turning point. Not fear, not acceptance, but irrelevance of reinterpretation. The predator remains visible in a final sustained way, but even visibility loses its old emotional weight. It no longer signals danger or anticipation. It signals completion of the reference system. Everything else has already been resolved around it. At this stage, the Badlands doesn't feel like it is continuing or ending. It feels like it has reached equilibrium, a state where all variables have settled into their final positions, and no further change is required for the system to remain stable. The survivors don't escape, because escape is no longer a defined output of the system. They don't die because termination is not the function being executed. They simply exist within a completed structure where all possible behaviors have already been accounted for, and the predator, unchanged, unmoving, still present, remains as the only constant that gives that structure coherence. Not as a threat, not as a savior, but as the fixed point that proves the system is finished being tested. And once that realization fully settles in, the Badlands doesn't close or conclude. It simply stops producing new questions. At this point, next doesn't really feel like progression anymore inside Predator, Badlands. It feels more like looking at what happens after. A system has finished telling its story but hasn't shut itself down yet. The space is still there. The survivors are still there in a physical sense. But the idea of forward motion, narrative motion, survival motion, even emotional motion, has thinned out to something almost abstract. There's no longer pressure building, no escalation waiting behind the next turn. Instead, everything feels evenly distributed, like the Badlands has flattened all remaining uncertainty into a single sustained state. And that's what changes the tone completely. The survivors don't talk about escape anymore, not even as a concept they can argue over. Escape implies there's still an outside, a direction that leads somewhere different. But the longer they remain inside this stabilized system, the more that idea loses meaning. Even the predator no longer registers as approaching or waiting. It simply exists within the same finalized field of awareness, not moving toward them, not moving away, just occupying its position as part of the structure that has already completed its evaluation phase. One of the survivors eventually reaches a point where they stop trying to interpret events in sequence. Instead, they start noticing that everything feels like it's already been accounted for, not predicted in a guessing sense, but contained in a finished model sense. Like every reaction they could possibly have is already represented somewhere inside the system's final state. And that realization removes something subtle but important, the feeling of influence. Because influence requires the possibility of altering outcome. And here, outcome no longer feels open, it feels recorded. The environment reflects this too. Earlier distortions, shifting geometry, and inconsistent pathways are gone entirely. Not resolved, just absent. What remains is a stable, almost neutral version of the Badlands that doesn't challenge perception anymore because perception is no longer being tested. It's just being held. At one point, one of the survivors tries something almost instinctive, reasserting individuality through decision, taking a path that diverges from the others without consulting or signaling. But the result isn't resistance or punishment. There's no dramatic consequence. Instead, the space simply doesn't differentiate the action in any meaningful way. The divergence doesn't create a new branch of outcome. It folds back into the same stabilized condition as everything else. And that might be the most unsettling part of the entire experience. Not that actions are stopped, but that actions no longer generate variation. The predator remains the most consistent presence, but even presence starts to feel like an outdated word for it. It doesn't engage, doesn't observe in the way earlier phases suggested, doesn't react to stimuli. It remains as a fixed element within the completed system, like a reference marker that everything else is defined against, even now. And in that way, it's no longer the center of tension. It's the proof that tension has already been resolved. The survivors eventually reach a point where they stop expecting anything new to occur, not because they've given up, but because the system itself no longer produces novelty. Every possible interaction state has already been expressed at least once somewhere in the cycle. And once that realization settles fully, something strange happens internally. Even confusion begins to fade. Not into understanding, but into acceptance of structure without needing explanation. The Badlands, as an experience, stops functioning like a sequence of events and starts functioning like a completed environment that is still being observed after its conclusion. The predator stands unchanged within that environment, not as a narrative force anymore, but as a constant embedded within the final configuration, and everything else simply exists in relation to that stability. There is no final confrontation, no escape sequence, no reversal of outcome waiting at the edge of understanding, just completion. And the absence of anything left to resolve is what defines the final state more than any action ever did. At this stage, there isn't really a next chapter in the traditional sense anymore, because the story has already transitioned out of escalation and into permanence. What remains inside Predator, Badlands, feels less like unfolding events and more like a locked condition. Something that continues to exist, but no longer changes its behavior in ways that produce new outcomes. The survivors are still present in the space, but their experience of time has become increasingly uniform. There are no longer distinct peaks of danger or relief, no clear moments that separate then from now. Everything blends into a continuous state where observation replaces progression. Even their attempts to interpret what's happening lose momentum over time, not because answers are found, but because the system no longer responds to interpretation with variation. Every new assumption they make leads to the same stabilized result, just expressed through slightly different perspectives. And that is where the psychological shift becomes permanent. The idea of control fades completely, not because they are overpowered in a conventional sense, but because control requires the possibility of change. And in this stabilized Badlands state, Change is no longer being produced. The predator remains within this final configuration, but its meaning has fully shifted from threat to constant reference. It no longer functions as an active variable in the way it did earlier in the story. It is simply there, occupying its position within the completed system, reinforcing structure rather than altering it. At one point, a survivor tries to reframe everything one last time, trying to reduce the entire experience into a single, understandable principle. Something that can explain why all paths converged, why every decision looped back, why perception itself became unreliable. But the problem is no longer lack of understanding. It's that understanding no longer changes anything. The system doesn't reject interpretation, it simply doesn't react to it anymore. And that absence of reaction becomes its own kind of answer. The Badlands, in its final form, feels like a finished model of behavior under extreme conditions, not a place where events are happening, but a space where all possible events have already been accounted for and compressed into a stable structure. Nothing new enters it, nothing leaves it, nothing evolves within it anymore. Even the predator, still present, no longer carries the emotional weight of anticipation or fear. It exists as part of the final equilibrium, no longer initiating change, only existing as confirmation that the system has reached closure in its internal logic. The survivors stop expecting resolution because resolution implies a final transition point, something that completes a journey. But here, there is no transition left to complete, only persistence. And persistence without variation eventually stops feeling like narrative altogether. What remains is a completed structure that continues to exist without needing to justify its own continuation. And in that stillness, the Badlands doesn't conclude in a dramatic sense. It simply stops offering anything further to interpret.
At this point, there really isn't a next in terms of plot progression anymore, because the Badlands has already crossed into its final condition. What's left is more like a sustained aftermath than an unfolding story. But if we stay inside this final state a little longer, something subtle becomes clearer. The survivors aren't experiencing change anymore, but they are still aware. And that awareness is the only thing that keeps the experience from becoming completely static. It's a strange contradiction. The system no longer produces variation, yet consciousness continues to register it as if something might still shift at any moment. That lingering expectation becomes its own form of tension, not because anything is happening, but because the mind hasn't fully accepted that nothing new will happen.
The predator remains within that same stabilized field, but even its presence starts to feel less like an entity and more like a fixed condition of reality. Not moving, not responding, not initiating, just existing in a way that defines everything else around it, by contrast. At this stage, the survivors can no longer meaningfully distinguish between observation and memory. Both feel equally present. Earlier events don't feel like they happened before, so much as they feel like they're still part of the same unbroken structure. The idea of sequence dissolves completely. And once sequence disappears, storytelling as a concept stops functioning in the usual way. What replaces it is something closer to recognition without progression. There's no longer an internal debate about what the Badlands is doing. That question has already been answered in every possible way it can be answered. Instead, what remains is the awareness that the system is self-contained and self-stabilized. Nothing entering it changes its nature, and nothing within it can push it toward a different outcome. Even attempts at emotional resistance fade into that structure, Fear doesn't escalate anymore because escalation requires feedback. Confusion doesn't deepen because there's no new contradiction being introduced. Everything simply repeats the same internal conclusion. This is what the system is, not a puzzle to solve, a condition to exist within. The predator, still present, functions almost like a reference point for that realization. It doesn't drive events forward. It doesn't pull anything toward an ending. It simply confirms that the system has reached a stable equilibrium where all variables have already been resolved into their final positions. And that's what makes the final impression of Predator, Badlands, so different from typical survival narratives. There is no final confrontation waiting to unlock meaning. There is no escape mechanism hidden behind understanding. There is only the recognition that the experience has already completed its function. Everything that came before, every chase, every fragmentation of trust, every environmental distortion, every encounter with the predator, was not building toward a climactic release point. It was building toward this stillness. And now that stillness is fully established, the Badlands doesn't feel like it is ending or continuing. It feels like it has reached a state where change is no longer part of its definition. And once that realization settles in completely, even the idea of next stops applying in any meaningful sense. At this point, there genuinely isn't a conventional next left to extract from the narrative in a way that still behaves like a story unfolding. But if we stay with what Predator Badlands ultimately becomes in this final stabilized phase, something important surfaces underneath all the earlier interpretation work. The most unsettling realization isn't about the predator anymore, and it isn't even about the Badlands itself. It's about how quickly meaning collapses when a system stops offering resistance. The survivors remain inside a space that no longer evolves, yet their awareness keeps trying to project evolution onto it. That mismatch creates a strange kind of internal echo. Thought patterns continuing even when the external world no longer provides new inputs to shape them. And that's where the final psychological tension really sits. Not in danger, not in pursuit, but in the inability to fully stop interpreting. The predator, still present in its fixed role, no longer feels like an active intelligence competing with them. It feels more like a structural constant that defines the boundaries of what possible outcomes ever were. Its presence doesn't change anything anymore because there is nothing left to change. It simply is the point everything else has already resolved around. At this stage, even the survivor's sense of self starts to lose sharp edges. Not in a dramatic disappearance, but in a gradual softening of distinction between experience and recall. Moments from earlier phases stop feeling like they happened in sequence and start feeling like they exist simultaneously within the same completed framework. That's the key shift. Time stops behaving like progression and starts behaving like structure. And once that happens, there's no longer a forward, there's only placement. The Badlands doesn't offer resolution because resolution implies movement from one state to another. Instead, what it presents is a fully realized condition where all movement has already been accounted for and absorbed into a final, stable configuration. Even the idea of escape becomes conceptually irrelevant, not because it is blocked, but because it no longer has a defined direction to attach itself to. The predator remains in that configuration, unchanged, not as an antagonist or even a participant, but as a fixed reference that confirms the system's completeness. And everything else exists in relation to that final fact. So when you ask for next here, what you're really touching is the edge of where narrative ends and static existence begins. Because Predator, Badlands, in this framing, doesn't continue forward anymore. It only persists in the state it has already reached. At this point, there isn't a meaningful next in terms of continuing story events, because the Badlands narrative has already fully transitioned into a closed, stabilized system with no further escalation or new developments being introduced. What remains is essentially a sustained final condition. The survivors are still present, the predator is still present, and the environment is still active, but nothing is generating new narrative change anymore. Every variable has already been resolved into a fixed equilibrium state. So instead of progression, what's left is just persistence. The survivors no longer experience anything that meaningfully alters their situation. Their perception continues, but perception itself no longer produces different outcomes. That disconnect gradually dissolves urgency, anticipation, and even the idea of conflict as something that can be resolved. The predator, in this final framing, is no longer functioning as an evolving threat or reactive hunter. It exists as a constant structural element within the system, something that defines the boundaries of interpretation rather than participating in active change. Its presence reinforces that nothing new is being introduced into the system anymore. And that's the key point everything collapses into. No new information is being created inside the Badlands, only repetition of a completed state. At that stage, even events stop feeling like events. They become re-experienced confirmations of what is already structurally known within the system. The sense of time flattens completely, because time requires change to register meaningfully. What's left is a world that continues operating without narrative momentum. No escalation, no reversal, no climax waiting ahead. Just a fully resolved environment still existing after resolution has already occurred. So there isn't a further next chapter to unfold from here without inventing new story material that goes beyond the established structure. Something changes in the Badlands in a way that doesn't fit the stable completion state anymore. It starts small, so small that at first it almost feels like imagination returning. A flicker in the consistency of the environment. Not movement exactly, but misalignment. Like two versions of the same space trying to occupy the same moment and failing to fully sync. The survivors notice it at different times, which is the first real sign that whatever held everything in that flattened equilibrium is no longer fully intact. One of them sees a corridor extend farther than it did before. Another swears the same corridor ended in a sealed rock face minutes earlier. There's no shared agreement anymore, but unlike before, the disagreement doesn't feel like confusion inside a completed system. It feels like contradiction returning. And contradiction is something the Badlands hadn't produced in a long time. The predator's presence changes at the exact same time, but not in the way they expect. It doesn't become more aggressive. It becomes inconsistent. Sometimes fully visible, sometimes absent when it should be impossible for it to disappear. Not stealth, absence of continuity. Like something that was once fixed in the system is no longer bound to its previous role. That's when the first real rupture happens. The ground beneath them doesn't shift dramatically. There's no collapse or explosion. Instead, the stability layer they had been experiencing simply stops holding in certain regions. The effect is immediate and disorienting. Depth perception returns in uneven waves. Sound becomes directional again. Even temperature begins to fluctuate in ways that weren't possible in the final stabilized state. It's as if the Badlands forgot how to stay finished. And that single idea introduces something dangerous back into the experience: time. Not the flat, completed sense of time they were trapped in before, but forward-moving time with variation. Change that doesn't loop back into confirmation. Change that leads somewhere uncertain again. The survivors react instinctively to it, but their instincts are outdated. They had adapted to a world where nothing new could happen. Now everything is new again, but without instruction. The predator reappears fully for the first time in what feels like a long stretch of non-presence. But its behavior is no longer consistent with the earlier observer state. It moves. It tracks. It adjusts position in response to their movement in real time instead of anchoring the environment. And that shift is the clearest signal yet. The system is no longer complete. Something inside it is active again. Not reset exactly, but destabilized. The group doesn't have time to process the implications before the Badlands begins to actively reorganize around them, but not in the controlled, interpretive way it did before. This is different. It's unstable restructuring. Terrain shifts without logic, then corrects itself mid-change. Pathways open and close in overlapping contradictions, like multiple rule sets are competing for control of the same physical space. One survivor finally says it out loud, voice low but certain in a way that cuts through the confusion. It's rebooting, not resetting cleanly, not returning to a prior stage, rebooting like a corrupted system trying to reinitialize while still running processes that were never fully shut down. And that's when the predator stops behaving like a constant. It starts behaving like an independent variable again. The first direct confrontation in this new phase is abrupt and uncontrolled. No structured buildup, no environmental manipulation, just immediate contact in a space that is halfway between stable and unstable. The predator moves with full physical intent now, but the environment no longer cooperates with either side. Every action has resistance again. Every movement creates ripple effects in terrain that doesn't fully settle afterward. One of the survivors is separated almost instantly, but this time the separation doesn't feel like system design. It feels like chaos. Like the Badlands is no longer selecting outcomes. It's struggling to maintain coherence. That distinction changes everything. Because now survival is no longer about decoding intention. It's about reacting faster than instability can reconfigure reality. The predator, too, seems affected. Its movements are precise, but no longer perfectly aligned with the environment. There are micro-delays, slight hesitations where there were none before, not weakness, but loss of synchronization with the system it previously operated within. That's when the deeper implication emerges. The predator was never just hunting within the Badlands. It was synchronized to it. And now that synchronization is breaking. The survivors begin moving differently too, not because they suddenly regained control, but because the constraints that previously shaped their behavior are gone. Decisions become chaotic again, but in a productive way. There are multiple valid directions now instead of a single converging outcome. It's disorienting, but it's also the first time in what feels like an eternity that action produces different results again. The Badlands itself begins revealing layers that were previously inaccessible. Structures that had been locked in final state now fracture open into alternate configurations. Areas they passed before reappear in altered form, suggesting that what they experienced earlier was only one resolved version of a much larger, still active system. And now those versions are bleeding into each other. At one point, they encounter remnants of prior cycles, not as static evidence, but as partially active echoes. Not memories, not ruins, but unstable reproductions of earlier groups or earlier system states. They flicker in and out of coherence like the Badlands is struggling to reconcile its own history. This is no longer a hunting ground. It's a corrupted archive trying to rebuild itself while still being used. And that realization reframes everything again. The predator is seen interacting with these unstable layers directly, not hunting them, not ignoring them, but correcting them, removing inconsistencies, stabilizing fragments of the system that drift too far out of alignment, which means its role has shifted again. It is no longer just a hunter. It is a repair mechanism, but a repair mechanism inside a system that is failing to stay unified. That makes every encounter now fundamentally unpredictable. Sometimes the predator engages the survivors directly. Sometimes it ignores them entirely to address collapsing sections of the environment. Sometimes it appears to prioritize system stability over pursuit. And that unpredictability creates a new kind of tension that didn't exist before. Not fear of being hunted, fear of being irrelevant to the system's priorities. Because if they are no longer the primary focus, then their survival is no longer guaranteed by engagement logic. They are just variables inside a broken framework competing with structural failure itself. The final stretch of this phase pushes everything into open instability. The Badlands is no longer a contained environment. It's expanding and collapsing in uneven cycles. Some regions stabilize for seconds at a time before dissolving again into incompatible configurations. Navigation becomes improvisation in real time. And for the first time since the beginning of the story, the survivors and the predator are not operating under shared rules. They are operating under competing ones, which means the conflict is no longer predator versus prey in a controlled system. It's multiple survival logics colliding inside a collapsing architecture. The predator makes one final visible assessment in this phase, standing at a junction where multiple unstable pathways converge. It doesn't attack, it doesn't retreat, it evaluates, then shifts direction, not toward the survivors, but toward a destabilizing fracture in the environment itself. And that single choice reframes everything one more time. Because now it's clear, the predator is no longer just responding to them. It is responding to the survival of the system itself. And the survivors, for the first time, are no longer the center of the structure. They are just one of several active instabilities inside a collapsing design that is trying, unsuccessfully, to reassert coherence. And in that chaos, something new becomes possible again. Not escape as a guaranteed outcome, but escape as an unresolved variable, which is something the Badlands hadn't allowed for in a very long time.